Hello, welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. Today, we are going to resume our Opium Golden Triangle series. And to help me, I have our returning guest, Mr. Davide Melia, all the way from Mangsi, Yunnan. Welcome back to the show, Davide.
Yeah, good to be back. I mean, we talked yesterday, but then we didn't end up getting on to Laos yesterday. We were talking about Myanmar and here in southwest Yunnan and this and that and the other thing. So we did talk about Laos a little bit, but only as far as the high speed rail across the border from China, from Yunnan into Laos, and then how that's
Originally wanted to plan maybe like 30 minutes, like 20 minutes tops to talk about the present before we take a
yeah.
take a trip to the past, but we got a little bit carried away.
It never works
So
out that way. Yeah.
so today we're just gonna go dive straight into history with the recent opening of the China-Laos Railway, which we have talked about. Now it's time to visit more recent history of the region, particularly during the time period that we were discussing on the Opium Golden Triangle series, because the Golden Triangle is actually a border region among three countries: China, Myanmar, and Laos. And that is why that area is called Golden Triangle. And so far, we have been focused on the activity of the KMT remnant army in northern Myanmar. Today, I want to switch track a little bit to cover the other side of the Golden Triangle, the Laos side of the story, because this is equally important and it's going to tie into our story later. I promise we're going to wrap up all the threads. So most of the information is from the excellent book by Alfred McCoy called The Politics of Heroin, which originally was published in the 1970s during the Vietnam War. It has been republished several times, and I think the latest edition is called Politics of Heroin, uh, the heroin in the global politics. And he laid out kind of the historical background of the opium and heroin trade, particularly in Southeast Asia. We cover a lot on the Myanmar side, and now we're going to talk about the Laos side, the eastern part of the Golden Triangle. And this has to do, again, with the European colonization of the region, because, opium, as we have introduced topics, opium has been well known in East Asia for thousands of years, but as medicine. And but when the British, introduced it as a recreational drug and flood the market with mass-produced Indian opium, which they had a monopoly on, that drove millions of people in China to become opium addicts, if not tens of millions of people. And that opium habits also start to spread throughout the region because, Southeast Asia for thousands of years have been very intimately linked by trade with southern China. When Guangzhou become like the ground zero of British opium trade, some of that opium gets leaked in through trade to places like South Vietnam, where there has been a long established a Chinese diaspora community over there. Initially, the Vietnamese emperor under the Vietnam's last Nguyen dynasty also tried to impose an opium ban, much like what the Chinese emperors have done in Qin dynasty, but they weren't very successful. And very soon, French will put a stop to the ban altogether when France just took over the southern half of the country using their gunboats. And within 6 months, France put together opium monopoly over the region, which enabled them to finance their colony and actually made their colony profitable. At that time, it was a very simple opium tax. So the opium are imported from the British India, and the French authority will levy a 10% tax on the opium, and before let it be distributed by the Chinese dealers in like the Saigon Cholong area to the addicts over there, and it became so profitable. The French coach in China, which is the southern Vietnam that France first occupied, uh, became self-sustainable in within 6 months on the opium revenue. At the same time, the Vietnam government, which still hold up in the north central part of the country, they had to pay a huge indemnity to France for the honor of being invaded, and to finance that large amount of silver they have to pay from France, they turn to the only quick source of cash, which is the tax on basically forced to legalize opium trade, put in together their own opium monopoly. And decades later, France also took over central and northern Vietnam, and the French, in trying to make their colonies sustainable, because France actually spent a lot of treasure. Go
This is
ahead.
part of what was called French Indochina,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah,
And as part of the French conquest to take over South, Central, and North Vietnam, French have to finance a lot of their armies, and it was very expensive. So France wanted to make their colonies self-sustainable. So they start to pondering how they're going to squeeze money out of their colonial enterprise, and they learned from their experience in southern Vietnam, where the opium monopoly was hugely profitable. So they quickly consolidate the opium monopoly within all the French Indochina colonies. They streamlined the bureaucracy, and they even put in a opium refinery in Saigon. So when they had the Indian opium arrive, it goes into this factory where they work out a method to mix the opium into a product that will burn very quickly. So it encouraged the addict to smoke even more opium.
yeah, a bit like low tech crack.
Yes, yes. And through this way, at one point, the French Indochina colonial government derive one third of its revenue from the opium tax. They have a monopoly on all the opium trade, and they take a 10% cut. And in fact, when we talk about railroads, when French was building their railroads from Vietnam into Yunnan, one of the specific rationale for building that railroad is to get access to the Yunnan opium. The reason for that is because the Indian opium, because it's imported from so far away from British India, is still quite expensive. But the French want to expand their opium revenue to cover all the poorly paid labor, common laborers, who also rely on opium to dull their pain. And who may otherwise not be able to afford the imported British opium. So the French allowed the Yunnanese opium to come in, to flood into North Vietnam to supply the lower end of the market, because as we have talked about, after the Second Opium War, British and French, they forced the Qing government to officially legalize opium trade, and as a
Yeah,
response. The Qing official decided to legalize the cultivation of opium as well. So very soon, within a couple of decades, by the end of 19th century, the opium production in China will actually overtake the Indian production and start to supply most of the needs of the Chinese opium addict. And then there's enough, more than enough for export, and especially in the case of Yunnan, because Yunnan is just very isolated in this very mountainous part of southwestern China.
A lot of there's something I might not have mentioned explicitly before. A lot of the population centers in Yunnan are based in mountain valleys, right? So
Yes.
you've got these basins. In the distant past, a lot of them were vast inland seas, but now there's subterranean water, and then you've got like these basins, which are basically agricultural production areas. I mean, quite a few people lived in the mountains and hills as well, but the population centers were all in these mountain valleys, like here, for example. And this is where you can do mass scale agriculture. So this is where you can grow a shit ton of um, this is where you can grow a shit ton of
Rice.
rice, exactly. And that if you have mass rice agriculture, that's where you can get real population centers. And that's that's like that's the basis of, say, an empire or a principality or a kingdom. Like mountain villages, they can do subsistence agriculture, but they can't mass plant rice or whatever. And so,
They don't have enough surplus to trade with other
yeah,
communities. Like,
exactly.
yeah,
And so if when trade opens up for these kind of places, they go, well, we could grow just enough rice to feed ourselves, or we could grow opium, and we could, like, you can make a lot more money, and then you can just use the money or the opium and just trade it.
yep,
But another thing about that is, if you're living in these mountainous areas or these valleys, these hilled valleys, mountain valleys, it's really hard for people to come in and force you to do something. Okay, so the local power, if people like, the French or the Qing or whoever want to force the people in these areas to do something, they have to go through the local authority or the local power base. So that's why you had these proxy systems where most of the actual governance and authority on the ground was undertaken by these regional powers, like the Dai Salpa or whoever else. And then,
yeah. The feudal system is maintained, and it's even strengthened.
yeah, the way that people force them to play ball is by saying, look, you've got your little kingdom or your little principality up there in the valley or up there in the mountain, but if you don't play ball, you're not going to be able to trade with anyone else outside of your local area. So they go, okay, if you play ball, if you play tribute to us, we will allow you to trade with everyone else who's part of our system. And in return, that will suit you as well, because then you don't have to worry so much about growing your own food. You can just grow opium or some other cash crop, and then you can
Yeah,
trade that, or you can get money. You become part of a larger economic system by playing ball with us, basically.
yeah, yeah. Opium became a cash crop. I mean, whereas before it might just be grow on a very limited scale for local consumption. Now it can be, packed on mule train and and traded down the river as far as Vietnam, and Thailand, and then you are now a part of the international system. And
Yeah, and the same thing goes on until today as well. That, like,
yep,
in
yep.
places like Myanmar and elsewhere.
Yep. So the French, at the time, they even specifically said, well, their goal of building the Yunnan Vietnam Railway is that, um, it is particularly interesting. At the moment, one is about to vote funds for the construction of a railway to Yunnan to search for ways to augment the commerce between the province and our territory. the regulation of commerce in opium and salt in Yunnan might be adjusted in such a way as to facilitate commerce and increase the tonnage carry on our railway. So the whole point of building the China Vietnam railway for the French was to for their access for the cheap Yunnan opium. And but the one reason is also I we talk about this in China. The largest opium growing region, number one is Sichuan,
Yeah.
number two is Yunnan.
Yeah.
The opium in Sichuan can be harvested and loaded on boats and sailed down the
Yeah.
Yangtze and
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
sent to the rest part of China. But Yunnan is landlocked and it's very mountainous, and like the Yangtze River part of Yunnan is not really navigable. So for Yunnan, it's actually easy. Its traditional trade linkage is with the rest of Southeast Asia via like whether the Red River or Mekong or Salween River, through these valleys. And so what ended up happening is, even though Yunnan had the second highest production of opium in China, mostly the surplus opium in Yunnan got exported to Southeast Asia. It exported. Some of them get smuggled into Myanmar, because whereas where British was also artificially keeping the opium price high to for because they wanted people to buy the imported Indian opium, and some of them get smuggled through Laos to Thailand, because the Thailand also had a opium monopoly at the time, because the Thai royals also strapped for money, so they quickly learned. They were forced to also to allow opium trade by the British, and then they decided, okay, we're gonna put our opium monopoly our own, so we can at least tax it. But then the British, again, imported British opium is expensive, whereas the smuggled Yunnanese opium is cheap. So there's always all these Yunnanese opium production that gets smuggled into Myanmar, to Thailand, to French Indochina. And
And that's
uh,
and that's
the,
why China, in large part, became, after the opium trade had been forced on China. That's why opium and heroin became so synonymous with China, even well into the 20th century, where they were referring to China White. Um, that
yes,
Chinese opium and heroin or Chinese opium really as a global commodity really started then, as a result of the British forcing the trade onto the Chinese after
yeah,
the emperor had said, "Look, we don't want a bar of this; it's ruining our people." Um,
yeah.
but then, as you say, like after that point, the leadership in China, like the imperial leadership, and then all the local leadership, have basically said, "Well, if we're being forced to do this business, we're going to benefit from it as much as possible." And but of course, the late era Qing dynasty is like really, really corrupted. So again,
Yeah.
a similar situation to Myanmar today, where you've got a handful of like government people and generals getting rich as kings, and everyone else just like in the worst poverty imaginable.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I mean, because back then the European colonial government, they didn't really care about welfare of the local people.
oh
They
fuck no!
came to the colony to explicitly make money off the backs of
Yeah,
their subjugated population, and
absolutely.
during the World War II, so the French Indochina had a mini opium crisis, because before their opium was mostly imported from abroad, aside from the Yunnanese supply. They import from initially British India, and later they get imported from places like Iran and Turkey.
Yeah, Turkey was massive in like early 20th century opium production.
Yeah. And in fact, that's where the Americans would get their opium to sell into China. So before the Opium War, the British had cornered about 90% of the Chinese opium market, and the Americans have about 10% of the opium market. Where the Americans, they will just sell to the Ottoman Empire, load up on the Turkish opium, and smuggle into Guangzhou, with the cooperation of the richest man in China,
Yeah, Hokwa.
Ho Kwa, and like this was, I think it was during one of the famines in Guangzhou. So Ho Kwa arranged it so it appears as Americans are shipping in rice, but underneath the rice they were shipping in opium.
That's a nice thing about opium. Even if you're doing like industrial quantities by volume, it's a much lower volume product than say
Yes,
rice. You can't
yes,
really compress a sack of rice down into a smaller
yep,
volume, but with opium you can just press it until it takes up almost no space, even though it's like worth hundreds of
yeah.
thousands or even more.
So at the beginning of the World War II, French Indochina had 25,000 opium dens, sustaining about 100,000 addicts and providing 15% of the colonial government tax revenue. And but then the opium importation from Iran and Turkey got interrupted because of war, because there's blockades, there's naval battles, and then following that, there's also the Japanese takeover. But Japanese takeover of French Indochina initially was a relatively peaceful affair, because on the ground, the Japanese actually left all the French colonial official in place to run their day-to-day affairs. But the problem is that they just don't have the opium supply, so they had to seek alternative resource. So while the smuggled in Yunnanese opium sort of meet the needs, but the French colonial government want a way to control it and tax it, because a lot of Yunnanese opium are coming in by smugglers that they're not able to get money from it. So they to solve that problem, they start to encourage the hills tribes to grow opium in Laos and northwest Vietnam. And this, particularly by the Miao and Yao tribesmen, and the Miao people. That ends a preview for the Silk and Steel podcast, episode number 161, the Golden Triangle and Opium Series, Part 7. To listen to the rest of the episode and the rest of the series, please subscribe to the Silk and Steel podcast on the patreon.com. Just go to patreon.com and search Silk. The Silk and Steel podcast will be the first results. I put in a lot of time and effort into this podcast, and I do appreciate your support. I hope you enjoy listening, and I hope you subscribe. Bye-bye.